The debate hall in New York was packed to the brim. Cameras from every major network zoomed in as the two men took their places at center stage. On one side stood JD Vance, Ohio's Republican senator, calm but firm, known for his working-class background and unapologetic defense of conservative values. On the other side, Zoran Mamdani, a rising star from New York's progressive wing, confident, fiery, and unafraid to push a radical agenda. From the very beginning, Mamdani made his intentions clear. He wanted to corner Vance, not with policy details, but with personal digs aimed at his past. Leaning toward the microphone, Mamdani smirked. "Senator Vance," he began, "you like to pretend you're the voice of working-class America. But let's be honest, your so-called roots are nothing but a story you packaged to win votes. You climbed up, you cashed in, and now you stand here as part of the very elite you once claimed to fight against." The progressive crowd erupted in applause, clearly delighted by Mamdani's jab. He leaned back, flashing a grin, as if the point had already been won. But Vance didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his microphone, his eyes steady, his posture unshaken. His pause created tension in the room, the silence building like a storm before thunder. "Congressman Mamdani," Vance finally said, his voice steady and deliberate, "you can mock my roots all you want, but they're real. I grew up in poverty. I watched addiction destroy families, including my own. And I climbed out, not by shouting slogans, but by hard work and faith. That's not a story, that's my life. And it's the life of millions of Americans who don't have the privilege of being lectured by a socialist from Queens." The hall erupted with gasps and scattered cheers. Even those who weren't Vance supporters felt the weight of his words. Mamdani's grin faded, his attempt at mockery suddenly looking reckless. This was just the opening blow. Vance had not only defended his past but turned it into a weapon. And the audience could sense the tide shifting. The room buzzed with energy after Vance's sharp rebuttal, but Mamdani wasn't ready to back down. Adjusting his glasses, he leaned forward again, this time with more intensity. "Senator, you talk about hard work and faith, but let's not pretend you pulled yourself up alone. You were educated at Yale, backed by billionaires, and lifted by a system designed to keep people like you climbing while the rest remained stuck. You claim to represent the poor, but your policies leave them behind." Applause surged from Mamdani's side of the audience. He gestured toward Vance, his hands slicing the air. "You're no different from the elites you claim to fight. At least I represent working immigrants who never had the luxury of privilege. I don't just tell stories, I live their struggle." The audience murmured approvingly. The contrast between the fiery progressive and the calm conservative was clear. But Vance didn't rush. He waited until the noise simmered, then leaned in, his voice low and firm. "Zoran, you've spent your life in comfort, preaching revolution from the safety of New York apartments. You mock my Yale degree, but let me tell you something, working-class kids don't end up at Yale by accident. They claw their way there. And if I'm part of the so-called elite now, it's because I fought every step of the way. That's not privilege, it's perseverance." A wave of applause erupted, even from parts of the audience that had cheered for Mamdani earlier. Vance continued, his tone growing sharper. "You talk about immigrants. I respect their hard work. But let's be clear, hard work builds opportunity, not handouts. What you call equality is really dependency. And dependency doesn't lift people up, it chains them down." The words cut deep. Cameras caught Mamdani's forced smile, his earlier swagger dimming. For the first time, he seemed on the defensive. The debate was no longer about clever lines, it was about credibility. And Vance had just seized it. Mamdani straightened his posture, clearly unsettled by Vance's words but determined not to lose ground. He gestured toward the crowd, his voice rising with passion. "Senator Vance, you speak of perseverance, but your vision of America leaves millions behind. In Ohio, families struggle with healthcare costs, with poverty, with jobs that don't pay enough to survive. Your party cuts benefits, denies people help, and calls it freedom. That's not freedom, it's abandonment. The progressive section of the audience erupted into cheers, sensing their champion fighting back. Mamdani pressed further, his tone sharper. And let's be real, your so-called working-class values don't include everyone. Immigrants, minorities, the marginalized, they don't see themselves in your story. They see a politician who climbed the ladder and then kicked it away so no one else could follow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The jab was personal, meant to paint Vance as a hypocrite. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Mamdani's fiery glare. For a moment, it seemed like he had regained the upper hand. But Vance leaned forward, his voice steady, carrying a calm authority that contrasted sharply with Mamdani's fiery tone. Zoran, you can shout about freedom and fairness all you want, but here's the truth: opportunity is not created by government handouts. It's built by hard work, responsibility, and strong families. You accuse me of kicking the ladder away, but I didn't. I built another ladder. The problem is, your policies would cut it down. The hall roared, a mix of applause and gasps. Even neutral listeners couldn't ignore the force in Vance's delivery. He wasn't just defending himself, he was framing Mamdani's vision as dangerous. Vance's eyes locked on Mamdani, his tone sharpening. You say I don't represent immigrants or minorities. But the truth is, the families who come here legally, who sacrifice everything for their children, want the same thing I did: safety, stability, and a future where their kids don't depend on government but thrive through their own effort. That's not exclusion, that's empowerment. The crowd thundered. Mamdani shifted in his seat, forced to adjust his strategy. The tension was now palpable. Vance's calm but devastating precision was beginning to silence the room. The tension between the two men was now undeniable. Mamdani, visibly rattled but refusing to show weakness, raised his hand slightly to quiet the crowd before speaking again. His voice carried the urgency of someone trying to reclaim control. Senator Vance, empowerment without justice is hollow. You talk about families and responsibility, but what about the families crushed by medical debt? What about the immigrant workers who toil for scraps while billionaires get richer? You call my policies handouts, but I call them fairness. Isn't America supposed to be fair? The progressive side of the audience erupted in loud applause, stomping their feet in approval. Mamdani, sensing momentum, leaned harder into the attack. You stand here as the so-called champion of the working class, but you stand with corporations, not workers. You claim to understand poverty, yet you defend policies that keep people in it. Senator, your roots might be poor, but your politics are rich. The jab was sharp, personal, and biting. Cameras zoomed in on Vance, waiting for his reaction. The silence in the hall was heavy with anticipation. Vance tilted his head, a small half-smile forming as he adjusted his microphone. His voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. Zoran, fairness is not about dragging everyone down to the same level of misery. It's about lifting people up so they can stand on their own. You talk about justice, but your version of justice is government deciding who succeeds and who fails. That's not fairness, that's control. The audience gasped, then erupted into cheers. Vance pressed on, his voice growing firmer. And let's talk about corporations. You want to tax and regulate them into oblivion. But who pays the price when they leave? It's not billionaires, it's the workers. The very people you claim to represent. That's the irony of your socialism, Congressman. You fight for workers in theory, but your policies hurt them in practice. Mamdani's face tightened, his earlier confidence clearly cracking. The applause for Vance was louder this time, echoing across the hall. The clash wasn't just ideological anymore, it was personal. And with each exchange, Vance's clapbacks were cutting deeper. The hall was now divided into two roaring camps, each side cheering for their champion. Mamdani, his eyes flashing with frustration, tried to mask the growing cracks in his confidence. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice sharper than before. "Senator Vance, you can dress it up however you want, but let's face it, you stand with wealth and power. You defend oil companies while the planet burns. You defend billionaires while workers struggle. You defend a system that benefits the few while millions suffer. That's not leadership, it's betrayal." The progressive audience clapped furiously, trying to drown out the counterchants from Vance's supporters. Mamdani raised his voice even higher. "You talk about ladders of opportunity, but what good are ladders when the ground beneath people is collapsing? Healthcare, housing, climate, these are not luxuries. These are rights. And the fact that you call them handouts shows just how far removed you are from the people you claim to represent." The crowd cheered, stamping their feet, eager for a knockout. For a split second, it seemed Mamdani had reclaimed the momentum. But Vance leaned forward, calm as ever. His voice, steady and deliberate, sliced through the noise. "Zoran, here's the difference between us. You see people as victims. I see them as capable. You want government to be their savior. I want government to get out of their way so they can be their own saviors." Gasps echoed, followed by a wave of applause. Vance didn't stop. "You say I defend billionaires. No, I defend builders, the men and women who create jobs, who take risks, who invest in this country. Without them, there's no ladder to climb. You'd rather tear them down in the name of fairness. But tearing down doesn't build up, it destroys." The audience erupted, louder than before. Even those skeptical of Vance felt the sting of his words. Mamdani shifted uncomfortably, his fire dimming under the weight of Vance's precision. For the first time, the progressives' arguments sounded rehearsed, while Vance's replies rang with lived experience. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a test of credibility. And Vance was winning it. The tension in the hall had reached its peak. Both men were locked in, the crowd hanging on every word. Mamdani, sensing his earlier blows weren't landing as he hoped, tried a different tactic. He lowered his tone, speaking with a calculated calm. "Senator Vance, I don't see people as victims. I see people as exploited, by corporations, by landlords, by a system designed to squeeze them dry. And you, sir, defend that system. You talk about builders, but the truth is, those builders don't share their wealth. They hoard it, while ordinary people break their backs." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the progressive side of the audience. Mamdani leaned in, pressing harder. "You call me a socialist as if it's an insult. If fighting for healthcare, housing, and dignity makes me a socialist, then so be it. But what does that make you, Senator? A champion of billionaires? A servant of Wall Street?" The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, many rising to their feet. Mamdani raised his chin, savoring the moment, believing he had struck gold. But Vance waited, calm as ever, before delivering his response. His voice cut through the noise, steady and deliberate. "Zoran, you keep painting me as a defender of billionaires. But here's the reality, you don't build a stronger America by punishing success. You don't help the poor by making everyone poor. You don't fight exploitation with dependency. You fight it by empowering people to stand tall on their own 2 feet." The hall roared, this time louder from Vance's side. He continued, his words sharper now. "You call yourself a fighter for dignity. But dignity doesn't come from government checks, it comes from work, from achievement, from building something that lasts. That's what my life has taught me, and that's what millions of Americans believe. You can call it conservative, you can call it old-fashioned, but it's the truth." The audience burst into applause, drowning out Mamdani's supporters. The camera caught Mamdani's face tightening, his earlier confidence slipping again. His attempts to frame Vance as a hypocrite weren't sticking. Instead, Vance's calm clapbacks were beginning to dominate the entire room. The air in the hall was electric, each exchange growing sharper, each rebuttal more dramatic than the last. Mamdani, realizing he needed to land a decisive blow, leaned forward again, his voice echoing with controlled fury. "Senator Vance, let's stop pretending. You don't empower people, you exploit their struggles for political gain. You take your story of hardship and use it as a shield while pushing policies that hurt the very people you claim to represent. That's not leadership, that's manipulation." The progressive side of the audience exploded in cheers, Mamdani's words igniting their energy. He pushed on, his tone dripping with disdain. "And let's not forget, you sit in the Senate, protected by corporate donors, by the same elites you pretend to despise. You've become part of the machine, Senator. You are not the outsider, you are the system." The crowd roared, stomping and clapping, convinced Mamdani had finally cornered Vance. Cameras swung to catch Vance's reaction, waiting for a flinch, a crack in his composure. But none came. Vance sat still, eyes locked on Mamdani, his calm demeanor unnerving in the storm of noise. Then, Vance leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a hammer. "Zoran, you can throw around words like manipulation and machine, but the truth is simple, I've lived the struggles I talk about. I don't need to borrow someone else's story. I don't need to shout about struggles I've never faced. I've been there. And I've fought my way out. That's not exploitation, it's experience." The hall fell quieter, the gravity of his tone pulling the energy back to his side. Vance pressed further. "You say I'm part of the system. No, Congressman, you are. You've lived in comfort while preaching struggle. You've built a career on outrage, not solutions. And while you sneer at my roots, those roots connect me to millions of Americans who see through speeches like yours. They want results, not rhetoric." The silence shattered into thunderous applause from Vance's supporters. Even neutral listeners were nodding, sensing the tables turn once again. Mamdani's eyes narrowed, but his earlier confidence was slipping fast. The clapback had landed, and it stung. The debate hall had become a battlefield of words, each round sharper than the last. Mamdani, refusing to let Vance's last strike define the moment, leaned into the microphone once more. His voice carried a mix of frustration and urgency. "Senator Vance, you can brag about your story all you want, but lived experience doesn't excuse harmful policies. You oppose student debt relief while families drown in bills. You oppose universal healthcare while people die from preventable illnesses. You oppose immigration reform while children are torn from their parents. That's not courage, that's cruelty." The crowd of progressives cheered wildly, sensing their champion had struck a moral chord. Mamdani's voice rose higher. "You stand here talking about ladders and hard work, but what kind of ladder do you offer? One built out of broken rungs, available only to a chosen few, while the rest are left to fall. That's the America you defend, Senator, an America for the privileged." Applause thundered across the hall, drowning out the tension for a moment. Mamdani looked confident again, his face lit by the energy of his supporters. But then Vance leaned forward, his expression unshaken, his tone crisp and deliberate. "Zoran, let me be perfectly clear, I don't defend cruelty, I defend reality. Life is hard. Struggles are real. And while you promise to take away every burden with government programs, I promise to give people the tools to carry those burdens with strength and dignity." Gasps spread through the hall, followed by growing applause from Vance's side. He didn't stop there. "You accuse me of building broken ladders. But the truth is, your ladders don't go anywhere. They're illusions. You give people just enough to keep them dependent, but never enough to set them free. I climbed my way out of poverty not because government carried me, but because I refused to stay down. That's the difference between us." The hall shook with applause, louder than before. Even neutral observers in the audience were leaning forward, drawn into the power of Vance's conviction. Mamdani's earlier fire now seemed overshadowed by the senator's calm, piercing clarity. This wasn't just a clash of ideology anymore, it was a clash of authenticity. And Vance's story was beginning to silence the room. The audience could feel the weight of the clash now. Every word struck like a hammer, every pause stretched the tension tighter. Mamdani, refusing to give up, stood straighter and raised his hand for silence. His voice rang with a mix of defiance and desperation. "Senator Vance, what you call empowerment, I call abandonment. You talk about dignity through work, but what about the single mother working 3 jobs who still can't afford rent? What about the immigrant family forced to choose between food and medicine? You sit here glorifying struggle, but some struggles are unbearable, and ignoring that is cruelty disguised as virtue." The progressive crowd erupted in cheers, some even standing to applaud. Mamdani lifted his chin, convinced he had struck a moral victory. He pointed directly at Vance, his voice rising with fire. "Your America leaves millions in the dust. My America ensures no one gets left behind. That's the difference between us, Senator, and the people see it." The cheers echoed across the hall. For a brief moment, Mamdani looked triumphant again, feeding off the energy. But then Vance leaned forward, calm, almost cold, his words cutting through like steel. "Zoran, I will never apologize for believing that people can rise above hardship. That mother you talk about, I see her not as a victim to be pitied, but as a fighter who deserves more than a government check. She deserves policies that give her safer streets, stronger schools, and opportunities for her children to succeed. That's not abandonment, that's respect." The hall roared with applause, this time louder than Mamdani's earlier standing ovation. Vance didn't stop. "You call it cruel to believe in perseverance. I call it cruel to chain people to dependency, to sell them hope that never arrives. You may mock my roots, but those roots taught me one thing: struggle is not a sentence, it's a starting point. And the people of this country know it, even if you don't." The room erupted. Cheers, whistles, chants. Vance's words had pierced through the noise and left Mamdani staring down a crowd that was no longer fully his. The clapback had landed with devastating precision. The hall was electric, the clash reaching its breaking point. Mamdani, his face tight with frustration, leaned forward for one final strike. His voice trembled with intensity as he tried to wrestle back control. "Senator Vance, you romanticize struggle because you escaped it. But millions never do. You speak of dignity, but what dignity is there in a child going hungry? What dignity is there in a family crushed by rent? You call it respect, I call it neglect. And history will judge which side of this debate truly fought for the people." His supporters erupted with thunderous applause, stamping their feet, waving signs, their chants reverberating off the walls. For a fleeting moment, Mamdani looked victorious, feeding off the surge of energy. Cameras zoomed in, capturing his fiery glare as if he had delivered the knockout punch. But Vance didn't flinch. He let the applause wash over him, waited until the room settled, then leaned toward his microphone. His voice came out calm, but carried a power that silenced the air. "Zoran, history won't remember who shouted the loudest. It will remember who told the truth. And the truth is this: hardship does not define us, it refines us. It doesn't chain us, it strengthens us. You call my vision neglect, but I call it faith, faith in the American people to rise higher than their circumstances." The crowd exploded, this time louder than at any point before. Cheers drowned out the progressive chants. People stood to their feet, clapping, roaring, chanting Vance's name. Mamdani tried to smile, but the cameras caught his unease. The room had shifted, decisively. Vance finished with a line that cut through the chaos like a blade. "You can mock my roots, you can dismiss my story, but you cannot silence the millions who share it. They don't want dependency, they want dignity. And no amount of rhetoric will ever change that truth." The applause was deafening. Mamdani leaned back in his chair, silent, while Vance sat steady, the victor in both tone and presence. The debate had promised fireworks, but it ended with a clapback so sharp, so final, that the room itself felt stunned into history.